I want to show you something that didn't make headlines when it was published, even though it probably should have been the biggest longevity story of that decade. In 1999, researchers at the University of the Ryukyus published findings from a study that had been running since 1975, 26 years of following more than 900 adults across Okinawa's oldest villages. What they found wasn't just that these people lived longer. It was that Okinawan women of the centenarian generation had a rate of reaching 100 that was roughly 40 times higher than American women of the same birth cohort. Not 40%, 40 times. And the finding that kept getting buried in the footnotes of every popular summary wasn't the purple sweet potato, which everyone mentions. It wasn't the eat until 80% full rule, which everyone mentions. It was a set of 3 practices that appeared consistently across virtually every centenarian in the dataset, regardless of what they ate, regardless of their genetics, regardless of whether they did anything resembling formal exercise. I've spent years reading primary longevity research, not summaries, the actual papers. And I keep returning to the Okinawa data because the gap between what the studies say and what gets explained in public is, in this particular case, significant enough to change what you'd actually do about it. The third practice in that set is the one that took me longest to understand. Not because it's complicated, because it's so quiet that it barely looked like a health finding at all. The researchers themselves almost moved past it. I'll show you why they were right to go back. Before we're done, I want to give you the full picture, including the piece that even people who've read the research tend to miss, because it reframes what the other 2 are actually doing. There is a woman in Ogimi, a small village in the northern part of Okinawa, sometimes called the Village of Longevity, named Matsu Oshiro. She is 101 years old. Every morning before the sun has fully cleared the ridge behind her house, she is in her garden. Not a decorative garden, a working garden. Bitter melon climbing the trellis, purple sweet potato vines along the fence, a patch of turmeric she's kept growing in the same spot for 30 years. She tends it with a short-handled hoe that belonged to her mother. She bends at the hip without hesitation. She straightens back up without holding on to anything. Matsu is not unusual in Ogimi. She is ordinary. In a village where the average life expectancy regularly exceeds the national average by nearly a decade, an active 101-year-old gardener barely raises an eyebrow. That is the point. Now consider David Renner. David is 58. He lives outside Minneapolis. He has a Fitbit, a standing desk, a refrigerator full of items that cost significantly more than they would have 10 years ago, because the labels say things like functional and probiotic and anti-inflammatory. He takes 3 supplements his doctor didn't recommend, but didn't discourage either. He is doing everything the modern wellness conversation told him to do. His last blood work showed C-reactive protein at 4.1 milligrams per liter. His resting heart rate is 74. He is, by Western clinical standards, unremarkable in all the ways that predict poor aging. David is not lazy. David is not uninformed. David has been given incomplete information by sources that should have known better. That is what I want to address today. And one more thing before we go further. There's something Matsu does every single day that ties all 3 of these practices together. It's not a food. It's not a supplement. The researchers who spent years in Ogimi almost overlooked it because it seemed too mundane to be meaningful. It isn't. And it's the reason that someone like David, doing everything he was told, keeps getting the wrong result. You've probably heard the following. Okinawans live long because they eat less, move more, and have strong community ties. The logic sounds solid on the surface, but the data tells a different story, or rather, a more specific one, and the specificity changes what you'd actually do about it. A 2007 paper published in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, drawing from the Okinawa Centenarian Study dataset, compared inflammatory biomarkers across Okinawan centenarians, mainland Japanese adults, and American adults in the same age brackets. The Okinawan centenarians showed inflammatory markers, specifically interleukin-6 and C-reactive protein, that were consistently lower than mainland Japanese adults of the same age, not just lower than Americans. This is significant, because if the explanation were simply eat less calories or move more, you'd expect mainland Japanese adults, who also eat relatively modestly and move quite a bit, to show similar numbers. They don't. Something specific is happening in Okinawa, and the calorie restriction explanation doesn't fully account for it. Americans spend roughly $40 billion annually on anti-inflammatory supplements: fish oil, turmeric capsules, boswellia, resveratrol. The Okinawan centenarians in the study achieved inflammatory profiles that no supplement trial has replicated in a controlled setting. Their anti-inflammatory protocol cost nothing. It was food, timing, and something harder to sell in a bottle. Let me show you what it actually is. The first practice is the purple sweet potato, but not in the way you've probably heard it explained. In Okinawa, the purple sweet potato, called imo, was for centuries not a side dish. It was the caloric center of the diet, accounting for somewhere between 60 and 70% of total daily calories in traditional Okinawan eating, according to dietary data compiled by researcher Bradley Wilcox and his colleagues. That's not a supplement. That's a staple. The average Okinawan centenarian in the study period ate roughly 300 to 400 grams of imo per day, about 2 medium sweet potatoes, prepared simply, often steamed or simmered in a light dashi broth. The mechanism here is clearer than almost any other food in the longevity literature. Purple sweet potatoes contain a class of compounds called anthocyanins, specifically cyanidin-3 glucoside and peonidin-3 glucoside, that function as potent free radical scavengers in vivo. A 2010 study published in the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry found that the anthocyanin content of Okinawan purple sweet potatoes is significantly higher than in orange varieties, and that these compounds directly inhibit NF-κB signaling, one of the primary molecular switches that drives chronic, low-grade inflammation. This matters because NF-κB is not just an inflammation marker. It's a transcription factor that, when chronically activated, promotes the conditions that precede most of the diseases we associate with aging: cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, certain cancers, neurodegeneration. The Okinawan centenarians weren't supplementing against these conditions. They were eating a food that kept the switch turned mostly off, consistently, across decades. Here is how to actually do this. You're not trying to replicate the traditional Okinawan diet exactly. That's neither practical nor necessary. What you're trying to do is make the imo your caloric anchor for 1 meal per day. Find purple sweet potatoes. They're increasingly available in Asian grocery stores and some natural food markets. The Okinawan variety, purple flesh, not just purple skin, is ideal, but any purple-fleshed variety contains similar anthocyanin profiles. Steam them whole or cut into thick pieces, about 20 to 25 minutes until just tender. Don't boil. Water leaches the anthocyanins. Don't roast at high heat, which degrades them. Steam or simmer in minimal water. Eat roughly 200 to 300 grams per sitting, which is 1 medium or 1.5 smaller potatoes. No butter. A little miso paste on the side is fine and actually complementary. The salt draws out sweetness. The fermented component adds a separate functional benefit we'll get to in a moment. Eat this as the largest component of one meal, ideally the midday meal rather than dinner, for reasons I'll explain shortly. The mistake most people make when they hear about Okinawan imo is they add it. They add it to a diet that already has a caloric center, pasta, bread, rice, whatever their staple is, and they expect the imo's compounds to work as an overlay. That's not how it worked for Matsu Oshiro. The imo replaced the staple. It wasn't additive. It was substitutive. If you add 300 grams of purple sweet potato on top of a normal Western dinner, you've added calories and a little anthocyanin. If you make it the center of a meal and eat less of everything else, you've changed the biochemical context entirely. Take a moment and think about what you ate for lunch today. Not to judge it, just to see it clearly. How much of it came from the earth and how much came from a package? That question is more useful than any macro breakdown. This is a significant change for most people, but it's not the whole picture. When you look at how Matsu actually eats, there's another layer that makes this work differently than it would in isolation. The second practice is fermentation, specifically the role of fermented foods, not as an add-on, but as a regular daily structural element of the Okinawan diet. The traditional Okinawan table includes miso almost daily and often includes a preparation of goya, bitter melon, that has been lightly salt fermented before cooking, plus pickled vegetables that appear as small accompaniments to most meals. This is not yogurt at breakfast as an afterthought. It's fermented food present at virtually every eating occasion, in small quantities, consistently. Here's where it gets interesting. A 2019 study published in Nature Medicine, not specifically about Okinawa, but directly relevant to the mechanism, examined the relationship between gut microbiome diversity and inflammatory biomarkers across aging populations. The researchers found that individuals with higher diversity in Bacteroidetes and Firmicutes species, the bacteria most consistently supported by regular fermented food consumption, showed measurably lower circulating levels of IL-6 and TNF-alpha, both key inflammatory markers. What makes this relevant to the Okinawan data is that the fermented foods in the traditional diet aren't providing probiotics in the clinical supplement sense. They're providing postbiotics, the metabolic byproducts of bacterial fermentation, and they're doing it through traditional lactofermentation, which produces a different and more complex array of compounds than pasteurized, shelf-stable probiotic products. Miso, in particular, contains over 200 identified flavor and bioactive compounds after fermentation. The pasteurized miso soup powder in a packet contains almost none of them. This is also where the imo and the fermented foods interact in a way that's been underreported. The resistant starch in cooked and slightly cooled purple sweet potato functions as a prebiotic. Specifically, it resists digestion in the small intestine and reaches the colon intact, where it becomes substrate for exactly the bacteria that fermented foods help establish. Eat the imo, eat the miso, and you're not just getting two functional foods. You're feeding and populating the same microbial ecosystem simultaneously. The centenarian who doesn't know the word microbiome has been doing this intuitively, or rather culturally, for their entire life. How to actually do this? 1 tablespoon of unpasteurized miso. Look for labels that say unpasteurized or nama miso, available at most Japanese grocery stores and online, dissolved in warm but not boiling water. Boiling kills the live cultures. Not hot enough to burn your wrist is the right temperature. Drink this or use it as a base for a simple soup at the start of your main meal. If you can find goya, bitter melon, try it stir-fried briefly with tofu and a small amount of sesame oil. It's bitter. That bitterness comes from compounds called momorticans, which preliminary research suggests may have their own glucose-regulating properties. The bitterness is not a flaw. It's the point. The Western error here is chasing probiotic diversity through supplementation rather than through food. A 2022 Stanford study comparing fermented food diets to high-fiber diets found that fermented food increased microbiome diversity more consistently than fiber supplementation alone. That finding didn't make headlines proportional to its significance. You now understand 2 pieces of this. The food that turns down the inflammatory switch. The daily fermented layer that builds and feeds the system. But there's something else happening in ogimi that the researchers almost missed because it seemed too ordinary to measure. It's the piece that makes people go quiet when they hear it. Not because it's complicated, but because it isn't. Before I show you that, let me put the Western picture side by side. The average American over 55 spends roughly $900 per year on dietary supplements. That's the industry average, per the Council for Responsible Nutrition. Another estimated $500 to $700 on functional foods, probiotic beverages, and fortified products. That's before any prescription anti-inflammatories, statins, or blood pressure medications, which bring the average pharmaceutical spend for this age group to over $1,200 annually. What does a traditional Okinawan household spend on the equivalent health maintenance? The imo is one of the cheapest foods at any Japanese market. Miso costs a few dollars for a container that lasts weeks. Goya is inexpensive. The fermented pickles are made at home, often from vegetables grown in a garden like Matsu's. The total cost of what I've described so far, practiced daily for a month, is probably less than a single bottle of the fish oil capsules David Renner takes every morning. Their doctor was their dinner table. Their anti-inflammatory protocol was a bowl of miso soup. Their longevity supplement was a purple sweet potato from a garden they tended every day, partly because it produced food, and partly, and this is where we're going, for reasons that had nothing to do with nutrition at all. Here's what I promised you at the beginning, and I want to be honest. When I first read the data on this, I went back and read it again. Matsu Oshiro tends her garden every morning. She has done this for as long as anyone in Ogimi can remember. She is not gardening for exercise. She is not gardening as a mindfulness practice. She has never thought of it that way. She gardens because the garden needs tending, because it feeds her and her neighbors, because her mother tended a garden and her grandmother tended a garden, and because stopping would mean something she doesn't have a word for, something closer to surrender than to rest. What Matsu has, and what the Okinawa Centenarian Study researchers eventually identified after years of looking for dietary and genetic explanations that didn't fully account for the data, is ikigai. Ikigai is a Japanese concept that translates roughly as a reason for being, or that which makes life worth waking up for. It has no direct English equivalent. It's not a goal. It's not a purpose statement. It's not a 5-year plan. It's the specific, daily, ordinary thing that makes a particular day worth having. The garden that needs water, the grandchild who visits on Thursday, the neighbor who depends on you to share your harvest. In the Okinawa Centenarian Study data, individuals who could articulate a clear ikigai, even informally, even just by describing their daily routine in terms of what they felt responsible for, showed measurably lower inflammatory markers, better immune function, and significantly higher 5-year survival rates compared to individuals in the same age bracket, without that sense of daily purposeful engagement. A 2008 study published in Psychosomatic Medicine followed more than 73,000 Japanese adults for 7 years and found that those who reported a strong sense of ikigai had a 57% lower risk of all-cause mortality compared to those who did not. 57%. That number appeared in a peer-reviewed journal, in a dataset larger than almost any nutrition trial ever conducted. It received a fraction of the coverage that any supplement with comparable effects would have generated. The mechanism is still being worked out. The leading hypotheses center on the stress-cortisol axis. Individuals with strong purposeful engagement show lower baseline cortisol and lower cortisol reactivity to acute stress, which directly reduces the chronic low-grade inflammatory load that is now understood to be the common upstream driver of most aging-related disease. A 2019 review in the journal Neuroimage found structural differences in the default mode network of individuals with high versus low sense of purpose. Actual measurable changes in brain architecture associated with purpose, not just self-reported well-being. The researchers who published the early ikigai findings almost buried them in a footnote, not because they doubted the data, because they didn't know what to do with a finding that couldn't be packaged and sold. There is no ikigai supplement. There is no 30-day ikigai program. There is only the specific, ordinary, slightly unremarkable thing that makes your day feel necessary. What is yours? And I'm asking genuinely, not as a rhetorical device. If you had to say, out loud, what makes this particular Tuesday feel worth waking up for, what would you say? For Matsu, it's a garden. For the men at the Caffeinio in Ikaria, it's the specific argument they'll have with Stavros about something inconsequential over coffee. For the Adventists in Loma Linda, it's a community they feel accountable to. The content of the ikigai is almost irrelevant. The presence of it is everything. Let me tell you honestly what to expect if you start making these changes, because I'm not going to tell you this will change your life in a week. In the first 7 days, you probably won't feel dramatically different. What you may notice is a slight change in appetite. Specifically, that the purple sweet potato as a caloric anchor at midday leaves you less hungry in the late afternoon than whatever you were eating before. This is the resistant starch doing its job. Don't interpret the absence of a dramatic signal as the absence of effect. By 30 days, many people report that their cravings for processed food quiet down rather than sharpen. This is consistent with the microbiome data. The resident bacterial populations begin shifting toward the strains supported by regular fermented food and resistant starch, and those strains have different preferences than the ones fed by sugar and refined carbohydrate. Your gut is not neutral. It is actively influencing what you want to eat. Changing its population changes the signal. At 60 days, I'd suggest asking your doctor for a specific blood work panel if you don't have one recently. Ask for C-reactive protein, high sensitivity, not standard, fasting glucose, HbA1c, and triglycerides. These are the markers most responsive to the changes I've described, and having numbers from before and after gives you something to look at that isn't just how you feel. At 90 days, the research suggests something more fundamental begins to happen. The behavioral pattern starts to feel less like a protocol and more like a baseline. The miso in the morning, the IMO at lunch, the fermented accompaniment, the daily thing that matters. It stops requiring decision-making. When something stops requiring decision-making, it's no longer a diet. It's a life. I want to be straight with you about one thing. This isn't magic. Nothing about it is magic. The purple sweet potato is a food. The miso is a condiment. The ikigai is a Japanese word for something your great-grandparents would have recognized immediately and had no name for because they didn't need one. The evidence behind all three is stronger and more consistent than most of what gets sold in the wellness aisle. But the evidence is not a guarantee, and I won't pretend otherwise. Matsu Oshiro is in her garden right now, or she was this morning, because it's always morning somewhere in Ojimi, and the bitter melon always needs checking before the heat comes up. She doesn't know about NF-κB signaling. She doesn't know her inflammatory markers. She couldn't tell you what an anthocyanin is. But she knows the garden needs her. She knows her neighbor will come by at midday. She knows exactly what she will eat and exactly why it matters. Not because she read about it, because the people around her have always eaten this way, and the people who ate this way are still here, and the ones who stopped aren't. The distance between you and Matsu is not genetics. It's not geography. It's three things. A food that anchors the diet in a way that keeps chronic inflammation low over decades. A daily fermented layer that builds and maintains the gut ecosystem that makes that food work better. And a reason, not a goal, not a strategy, a reason for the day to matter. Here is what I want you to do tonight. Find a purple sweet potato. If your nearest grocery doesn't carry the purple-fleshed variety, find the closest substitute and order the real thing online for next week. Steam it, not boil, not roast. Eat it as the center of dinner, not the side. That's the first step. One food, one meal, tonight. Then, before you fall asleep, try to answer one question honestly. What is the thing you feel most responsible for tomorrow? Not the most important, not the most meaningful, the most necessary. The thing that, if you don't show up for it, doesn't get done. That question is harder than buying a sweet potato. It's also the more important one. I publish a new piece of this research every single day. A different zone, a different centenarian, a different layer of the science. If that's what you're looking for, subscribe and I'll see you tomorrow. Which of the three practices surprised you most? The food, the fermentation, or the ikigai? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.